I'm not sure I totally agree. I'll be honest with you.
Sure, yeah.
I once wrote a book with the title "Foreign Policy Begins at Home," and what I learned I had to remind people after I wrote that book is that even though foreign policy begins at home, it doesn't end at home. It continues abroad. And if the image that I find useful is to think of national security as a coin with two sides. There's a domestic side and there's an external side. And I think both are critical for a country. Now, look, China and the United States have fundamentally different political and economic systems. We have different histories. We have different values. I expect many people in China think the Chinese model is preferable. Obviously, here I think the American model is preferable for many reasons. We don't need to debate that. The question is, can we manage U.S.-Chinese relations given these differences? That, to me, is the foreign policy challenge for both governments. And the reason I think it's a challenge is it's not easy, given these differences. U.S.-Chinese relations have deteriorated significantly in recent years and decades. But I still believe we have something of a shared common interest in managing our differences. And at a minimum, the two countries have a shared interest in not seeing the differences slide into conflict. And more optimistically, more positively, the two countries have potentially a shared interest in seeing the two governments, the two countries cooperating where there might be some agreement. And so that to me is that's the challenge for diplomacy for the United States and China. How do we, at a minimum, avoid the worst? And somewhat more optimistically, can we build some areas of at least limited cooperation where it's in our common interest to do so? I don't know. And again, it's interesting. During the Cold War, you mentioned the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, the United States and China had a certain common interest in opposing the Soviet Union. And that provided the impetus, the rationale for areas of U.S.-Chinese cooperation. Then when the Cold War ended 3 decades ago, we had to find a new foundation for our relationship. And we largely found it in economic matters. And the whole idea was the United States and China would become economic partners. China would be a big market for American goods and investment. The United States would be a big market for Chinese exports. We would become a source of technology that would help your development. The United States entered into that with China, but quite honestly, many Americans are disillusioned and very unhappy with the results. We had been hoping that this would lead to a China that was more open politically and economically, more moderate in its foreign policy. And since I'm no longer a diplomat, I can be blunt. Quite bluntly, that is not the China we see. We see a China that is less open politically and economically and more assertive in its foreign policy. So there's disillusionment in the United States with the course of U.S.-Chinese relations. So the question, though, arises, here we are 3 decades after the end of the Cold War. Can the United States and China find a formula, again, for at least avoiding conflict, be it over Taiwan or something else, and ideally for cooperating, for example, to cooperate on a challenge like North Korea, or cooperate on a challenge like Iran, or on climate change, or infectious disease, or Ukraine. And so far, the results are not promising. The results are disappointing. We obviously just had the meeting in Bali between President Xi Jinping and President Biden. We have the upcoming trip of Secretary of State Blinken to China. So we'll see. We'll see what comes of this renewed interaction, this renewed face-to-face diplomacy. And so that's where we are. That's where we are in our history. But I think we have to be realistic. It has been a disappointing few decades for U.S.-China relations. And the question is whether the two countries can turn this around.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. Thank you, Richard, actually, for your very candid, points. Yeah, I think that in the last 3 or 4 decades, I mean, particularly last 4 decades since China opened up, I mean, Chinese economy has grown, many times over, and of course, even since the Second World War, if you look at the last 7.5 decades, where the Bretton Woods system that U.S. led, has really made the whole world prosperous, several hundreds of times already. So in a sense, the globalization that we've been seeing in the past has worked relatively well of this global order that U.S. led since Second World War. Second World War II is still functioning, and China wants to said many times. China likes to see this order continue and wants to maintain, this multilateral order and also how to improve it, enhance it. Of course, you wrote many things on that as well. I know that you mentioned about 21st century concert of powers, and of course dynamics of U.S., China, EU, and you even mentioned the notion of G6. If a G7 doesn't work well, and so we see G20 you mentioned just happened, and we see some face-to-face meeting that is really important. I think this COVID isolation for the last 3 years really doesn't help at all. It's really accelerate the tension, obviously. So what do you think about the future global order and how we can reach a new balance of equilibrium? Maybe now we all look at more domestically, and rather than really not happy with each other on its values, on its models, on its development. Because after all, I think the whole world is better off with all this trade and economic prosperity, and hundreds of billions of people lived without poverty. So what do you think about the future, global system? I mean, even for this current Ukraine-Russian war going on, and how we can really get a solution out of this? Can we have a 7-party talks, P5 plus EU plus Ukraine? Or let's get the G6, as you mentioned, sit down and talk. And President Xi mentioned quite a few times, China is willing to participate to promote the peace and talks. I even wrote the op-ed in the New York Times in March this year that saying China could really play a more active role there. So what do you think, how we can, you mentioned so many common threats like climate change and pandemic,
sure.
Nuclear proliferation and North Korea and Iran. And all this. So
let me make, you raise a lot of good points. So let me make a few general points and then one specific one. Mm-hmm. I'm worried about the state of world order. It has been deteriorating in recent years. That's just a fact. It is. It's deteriorating for several reasons. One is we've seen the reemergence of serious geopolitics, and we've seen a blatant use of force in Europe with Russia. And we've also, at the global level, seen a large gap open up between global challenges and global responses. So at both the geopolitical level and the global level, we've seen a deterioration of order in the world. And it doesn't matter if we talk about G6s, G7s, G20s, G83s, G anything. It doesn't matter. The numbers don't matter. What really matters is whether the major countries see things similarly and are willing to act in a collective fashion. And quite honestly, you take the biggest immediate threat to world order, which is the Russian aggression in Ukraine, and it's disappointing. Quite honestly, China's no limits agreement with Russia just before Russia invaded Ukraine was a disappointment. China continues to buy oil from Russia, allowing it to skirt sanctions. Now, it's also let me be fair, China has also, as best I understand it, not provided Russia with military support. That's welcome. China has expressed its concerns about any threat or use of nuclear weapons. That's a welcome development. But the most basic concept of international relations, the most basic concept of order, is that force ought not to be used to as an instrument of international relations, particular to violate sovereignty. And that's what Russia has done. So this is a real, it's, by the way, very similar to what Saddam Hussein and Iraq did in 1990 when it invaded Kuwait. Saddam Hussein claimed that Kuwait was part of Iraq and invaded it and made Kuwait part of Iraq. And then the United States, working, by the way, with much of the international community through the United Nations, built a coalition that liberated Kuwait, and it reinforced the rule, the norm, that territory should not be acquired by force. We haven't seen anything similar to that this time. It's, yes, the United States has worked with its allies, mainly in Europe, but the international response has been disappointing. And I would say China's performance has been somewhat disappointing as well. And so that's where we are. So, and if one looks at what just happened on climate change, the meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, the COP27 was, to me, almost a total failure in dealing with climate change and narrowing the gap between the challenge and global response. So what happened on COVID was disappointing. We could go through it. The world, we have something called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Well, North Korea withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and now North Korea is increasing the size of its missile force and also its nuclear arsenal. That's disappointing. So I'm worried or not optimistic about world order, simply because I don't see the willingness of the major powers to work together to promote it, even though I would argue it's in their interest to do so. So ideas of a concert, which I have put forward, quite honestly, the world isn't ready for it. We're actually farther away from it today than we were a few years ago when Charlie Kupchan and I wrote that article. It's been a bad couple of years. And so that's where we are. We don't have the luxury of giving up. We've got to continue to try to deal with our differences, but I think we've got to be intellectually honest that it's been a disappointing few years. It's the reason I would say it's essential that Russia not succeed in Ukraine. It's essential that Russia not succeed. Ultimately, I would love to see Russia reintegrated into the world, but it's got to be a Russia that's willing to be integrated on terms that are consistent with order. And that is not Mr. Putin's Russia. But that is where we are. So, the United States and China have lots to talk about, whether it is to deal with Ukraine or global challenges or Taiwan. Again, the question with Taiwan is, for nearly half a century, the United States and China have, how would I call it? We've managed to agree to disagree on Taiwan. We haven't solved the problem, but we've managed the problem. We've managed the situation. And the question going forward is, can we continue to manage the situation in a way that's acceptable to all the parties? And that, to me, is a realistic diplomatic challenge. That's not impossible. We've done it for nearly half a century. And the question is, can we continue to do it even if there's areas where we don't disagree? And I would simply say, I would hope so, because the consequences of a breakdown in our ability to manage the Taiwan situation, I believe, would be terrible for everybody, for China, for the United States, for Taiwan, for the region, for the world. But that's where we are. So that, I actually think the biggest immediate threat to order is Ukraine and what Russia is doing. And then I believe in the future, the biggest geopolitical challenge will be Taiwan. And I think the biggest global challenge will be climate change. And that is where I believe we are in history right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, you're very frank and very stimulating discussion. Actually, I think on the Russian China, this February 4, because Biden was in China, was actually talking to President Xi last November, saying, okay, all those good, 4 no's and one not intended. But actually, the moment he went back, he said, okay, I'm going to boycott Beijing Olympic. Whereas Putin said, okay, don't worry, I'm coming. And so I think there's some reciprocal on that for Putin come to China on February for really supporting Beijing for the Olympics. But China says, friendship has no meaning, everlasting, or is friendship is boundless. That's a diplomatic language they use very often. But I think the fact is, you're right. China defense minister said that Shangri-La, China does not provide any material military support to Russia. And President Xi actually told President Biden and Chancellor Scholz, of course, they don't want to see any nuclear weapon being used. So those are very strong messages. I think even at the Shanghai Cooperation Summit, Putin was not happy, saying, "Oh, President Xi, you have worries, you have concerns on Ukraine, and let me explain you in private." So you can see we are not really 100% with Russia. I mean, China, is doing that because I think U.S. has put China as enemy number 1. So I think China was forced to probably to be a little cozy with Russia, but it's not really intended by China. So I think U.S. has to think about what is the most urgent issue, rather than still forming IPAF and all those Quad and AUKUS, really aiming at the China. So I think China probably was a defensive move. So I think we hope to have more face-to-face discussion with senior officials of both sides, so really can clarify really the positions. But you're right. You mentioned about Taiwan as well. I think again, we're in a much more dangerous war now, and Taiwan is in the last 4 decades since the 3 joint communique was really, as you said, kept in more or less the status quo. But we don't want to see a parade of senior officials from U.S. To visit Taiwan, where no official ties of in the communique was violated, and then China has to really every time to show its protest, and by flying over the mid line or doing military exercise. But there's one things happening now. You see, recently there's midterm election in Taiwan, and the KMT has swept almost all the mayor's seats, and KMT recognized 92 consensus, one China, on both across the street, Taiwan street, and also, so if you think there's economic integrations, before DPP was there, China has quite a number of a few million tourists flooded Taiwan. There's student exchanges. There's marriage between husband and wives across the street. Taiwan enjoys the biggest surplus. I mean, the economic integration probably will serve the peaceful unification in the end, rather than we are having this, all the senior official visit in the U.S. or. So what do you think about the peaceful prospect of Taiwan if we let's all back down and let's all seek this peaceful resolution and let the after all they share the same language, culture, heritage, and relatives. I think mainland Taiwan eventually could be peacefully merged as time goes on. I mean, it could be 1 country, 2 system, 1 country, 3 system, whatever. So what do you think? If the U.S. can be more, less probably aggressive on that Taiwan policy.
We obviously see things differently there.
Yeah.
From your point of view, it's the United States, by what we're saying and doing, that is challenging the status quo and leading the mainland to react. We would see it the other way around. We see China changing the status quo in many ways by what it's saying and doing, particularly with its military forces. And we see ourselves reacting. We also see ourselves acting consistently with the One China principle and with the 3 communiques. We're not going to resolve that today, you and me. Again, what matters, I would say, is that the United States and China continue to discuss this and set some rules of the road. So again, we don't have to agree, but we have to figure out how we agree to disagree and how we don't allow our differences to spill over into confrontation. In terms of, more broadly, I believe President Biden was right when he said the other day that we oppose unilateral actions, be it by any party, be it the mainland or Taiwan, that would destabilize the status quo that I believe has served everybody's interest. If you look at the last 40, 50 years, you look at the extraordinary progress the People's Republic of China has made. You look at the extraordinary progress that the Republic of China has made. You look at the extraordinary progress in the region, look at extraordinary progress here at home in the United States. I believe everybody has benefited from the ability to manage our differences here. And to me, that's I don't think we're going to resolve them anytime soon. You mentioned 1 country, 2 systems, what have you. I believe the prospects for that were significantly damaged by what happened with Hong Kong. I think the idea of 1 country, 2 systems now is no longer widely respected or accepted as a viable path. And Taiwan, is a democracy, is on a very different trajectory, but I believe people there understand that unilateral actions such as announcements of independence would be destabilizing. I don't know how to interpret the KMT victories in the recent elections. I'm not sure. I don't claim to be an expert here. I'm not sure they set a precedent for the presidential election in 2 years. I think the dynamics around elections, say for mayor, are very different than the dynamics around the election of a president. So I'm not smart enough to know what will happen in 2 years, but I don't assume that what just happened locally will necessarily happen nationally. But we'll see. We'll see in 2 years.
Yeah.
So, but again, I think to me, I want to avoid unilateral action, and I want to avoid actions that would lead to that would destabilize a situation that, however imperfect the mainland sees this situation. I believe if people act unilaterally or act coercively, the results would be far more imperfect. So, I always try to distinguish in my mind between what I call problems and situations. I don't know how this translates into Mandarin, okay. But I see the Taiwan issue as a situation, not a problem. It doesn't lend itself to an immediate solution. I believe it lends itself to being managed, and that to me, sometimes in diplomacy, that's the most you can do. Mm-hmm. You can successfully manage something, and I worry that attempts to quote unquote solve the Taiwan issue actually could do just the opposite. And I just think we have to continue to be realistic about what we can accomplish. And again, however frustrating or imperfect the status quo might appear to be from a particular vantage point for those in the mainland who want Taiwan and the mainland to be one, to those in Taiwan who want independence, however imperfect the status quo might be, attempting to bring about these alternatives, I believe, would set in motion a chain of events that would be extraordinarily costly. So again, I come out in favor of managing a situation rather than solving a problem as the best way to understand the Taiwan issue.